Oh god, you guys. I'm gonna be honest. I've been avoiding this video for a while. I honestly considered scrapping this video altogether. Uh, and if you don't know what I'm referring to, a couple months ago I released a video titled Everything Wrong with Edison Format. Um, that video was received very poorly by the Edison community, and honestly, understandably so. I don't think I structured that video very well, and in all honesty, I didn't put a whole lot of thought into it. Full disclosure, I'm still a new YouTuber, right? I've only been doing this for like 3 months now, and so, I recognize that not every video I produce is going to be a masterpiece, although most of them are, so you should definitely subscribe. Um, that being said, I didn't want to just leave this subject hidden. I didn't want to just like forget about it. I felt like I needed to address some of the takes I made in that video because I don't want to leave like a bitter taste in my viewers' mouths and even the Edison community's mouth. I don't want to like leave a bitter taste for y'all because, like I said, I don't think that video was very fair. So I am going to readdress it. And I'm going to first just talk about my goals of this video because I think this is important to highlight. My goal of this video is not to shit talk Edison or even convince you not to play Edison. Like, I couldn't care less if you love Edison or not. Like, it's not my goal to like make you do this. My thing on Edison is I feel like it grew in popularity for the wrong reasons, and because of that, it tends to overshadow the better format, and that format is September 2011. My goal is just to get you as viewers to try the format because I personally believe that if a player tried both formats, majority of them, and like this, like I said, this doesn't speak for everyone, but majority of them would find that 2011 is just far and away better. Like, I'm confident the gameplay speaks for itself. So you don't have to listen to a single take I have about this format, about Edison format. Doesn't matter. Just go try the September 2011 format. That is my only goal in this video, is just to do that, as well as kind of clarify some of my points that I made in my last video, right? So give the format a try, give it an honest try, not just playing a Tengu mirror with your buddy once and then being like, oh, this format sucks. I mean, like, play a couple different decks, maybe enter a tournament, just give the format an honest shot. Like, play, experience it, not just, like the Tengu plant deck and then call it good, right? Like, there's so much more depth to this format. And honestly, I feel like Edison format is popular because it's well liked because people feel it is balanced, it's diverse, and it's skillful. And I think those are genuine qualities of Edison format. I think that's true. But my thing is I just feel like 2011 is more balanced, more diverse, and more skillful. So just give the format a shot. That's all that I really care about it. So, that being said, we got to put up a disclaimer. This video is subjective, okay? These are my personal takes on Edison format. I will be talking about why I think that format isn't that great. And that's just to clarify on my points I made in my first video. Like I said, I don't really care to shit talk the format or anything like that because, like I said, my only goal is for you to try 2011, not to, tell you how bad Edison is, right? I'm very confident in your guys' ability to figure these things out on your own. But I want to accelerate that learning. I want to show you that why 2011 is so much better, and honestly talk about how Edison got as popular as it did. Because I think a big take is, oh well, if 2011 is so much better, why is Edison more popular? And I'm gonna address that. It all starts with a timeline, so let's move into that timeline. Let's jump into that. Yeah. All right, guys. So let's dive into this timeline, and I can't say for sure certain that, hey, this is 100% exactly how it went. But I have a pretty good idea that this is like what happened, relative to like, the experience most people in retro Yu-Gi-Oh have had. And I'm going to be honest, like, it doesn't speak for everyone, but I do think this applies to a good majority of like the Time Wizard player base or the retro community, right? So this all started around probably 2016, 2017. I feel like a lot of people started like diving into older formats, especially as you creep up on a 2018. Like, I think Goki format was like pretty bad for everybody. And so people started looking into old formats, right? So a majority of the player base that wanted to do it, they started playing GOAT format. Everyone went back to GOAT. There was just a time where GOAT was like the only retro format you would hear about. It was far and away the quote unquote best. Everyone loved it, right? You continue going down the years and you hit 2021. And this is when E3 Yu-Gi-Oh started making videos, actually, like in around 2021, maybe late 2020. He started making videos talking about Edison format. So what happened was the people in the GOAT format community started feeling like, hey, GOAT's a little too slow for me, right? I want something that's a bit more faster paced, something that, you know, involves the extra deck, stuff like that, right? Like they want just a bit more, a bit faster pace of a game than GOAT, because GOAT is very slow. So what happened was people from the GOAT community started switching over to Edison. They went down the list of the years. So, you know, you're looking at all the next format, and the next like decent format, there's really none like that are like very diverse and skillful that like people really latch onto for a good format until you hit around Edison format. And that's what happened. They landed on it. And at this point, E3 made a video titled "Why Edison format is definitively better than GOAT format."
There's a big problem with this idea of GOAT format being the best format.
What is that?
And that problem
what is that problem, James? What? Tell the
glad
people.
You asked, Egan. I'm very glad you asked. That problem is that it's built on a lie. And there is, in fact, another format, a little gem of history, that is actually the best format in Yu-Gi-Oh history.
One might call it
Keegan.
the greatest format of all time.
Some might call it the GOAT format.
Yes.
Not to be confused with GOAT format.
Not to be confused with GOAT format.
Keegan, why don't you tell people what is Edison format?
Right? And honestly, that video was pretty well received. So like, it's interesting, right? He made that video talking about why the gameplay was better, right? He like recognized a lot of people were bandwagoning GOAT, but then he also was like, you know, I think there's something a bit better if I go a bit further. And he did, and it was, right? Like, at least to him, right? Like that. So he started sharing that, and people were like, hey, you know, this is cool. This is a cool retro format that basically is like a bit faster than GOAT. So people started doing that. Along that same time, History of Yu-Gi-Oh had landed on Edison format as well. And so History of Yu-Gi-Oh, the series done by Simo and MBT, that is one of the like primary sources, at least as like far as the series goes. It's like one of the most watched series to showcase old formats and like, you know, just these retro formats in general. So like they recognized that Edison was growing in popularity, so they started talking about how great Edison was. And it wasn't just like they said like how great it was in their single video. They took it to the extreme. They did 4 videos on Edison format.
Be sitting down with you today because, folks, we have made it. Welcome to Edison format. Well, folks, we are back out of the shirt of shame, back into a tied series, and back again with another episode of the History of Yu-Gi-Oh! About Edison format. Here it is, the culmination of all of our Edison explorations, a semi-faithful interpretation of the final round of SJC Edison. I am so happy we get to do this one. Oh my god, not even being in the shirt of shame could dampen my mood for today because we are playing Diva Hero. Now, the series has kind of shifted out of my favor, but not to worry, this is the deck that's gonna bring it back. And surprising pretty much no one, this is my all-time favorite deck in Edison format.
I mean, come on, guys. Is Edison actually the greatest retro format, or is it just simply the loudest retro format? You know? Like, I was like, oh my god, like, they're going ham. But, you know, like, I don't know. I personally thought, I was like, okay, well, you know, they're just highlighting the popular formats. They'll probably do the same for, like, 2011, right? So that happens, and then basically, with the support of History of Yu-Gi-Oh! And, like, the new, like, content creation of E3, people really started bandwagoning Edison format. It got really, really big, right? And so that is the average historical Yu-Gi-Oh player's timeline. They went from GOAT to Edison, and they just stopped, right? At least that's how I feel. I feel like that's how it went, right? So let me explain my timeline. This is exactly what I did, right? Around 2016 exactly, I wanted to start exploring old formats. So what I did is I actually bought every single like tier 1 deck from every single different format, like, you know, throughout the years, from like starting from like 2012 going down, right? And I actually wanted to revisit my favorite format first, which at the time was the wind-up loop format, which, you know, after going back to it and replaying it, I realized, like, this format's terrible, right? And I think this is also, like, a thing to take note of, like, for people who say, like, oh, I played X format historically, until you go back and replay it, like, you know, you might remember things differently, like, because a lot of times I feel like, you have fond memories of formats you had a lot of success in, and not necessarily formats that were like inherently good. So sometimes people are like, oh, I really enjoyed it, but it was mostly because they topped a lot of events in that time or whatever. And that was the case for me, right? Like, I did pretty well in this format, and I went back and replayed it, and I was like, the gameplay is actually, like, not very good, right? So from like a gameplay point of view, it's not very fun. It's very die roll dependent. Didn't like it. I then realized that, like, if you jump a little bit further and go to, like, late 2012, early 2013, you have, like, the YCS Miami format where there's, like, Mermail, Fire Fist, Wind Up OTK, all that stuff. Like, all the decks that are, like, OP in this format are now, like, toned down, and it just feels a bit more balanced and fun. So I was like, okay, this is pretty good, right? Like, like, this is why I remember this so fondly. I think it was actually just YCS Miami that I was thinking of, where, like, this was, like, decent, right? So I like this format, and I decided I wanted to keep going down. Reason I didn't go to Hat was because, like I said, I started this in 2016, so Hat was still relatively fresh in my mind, right? Like, you know, that was only a couple years ago. And, like, I liked Hat to a degree, but, you know, I just really wanted to go a bit further, and, like, play, you know, more retro stuff. So I went from Wind Up to 2011. I hit 2011, and I was like, oh my god, this format's nuts. Like, the more I played it, the more I was like, wait, literally, like, every deck you could possibly play is viable. Every single, like, there's so much diversity, there's so much skill, like, every decision is so critical. And, like, yeah, just while playing it, I just realized, like, oh, like, there is just so many good qualities of this format, to a point where, like, it almost felt like if you were trying to make any deck function, like, literally any archetype, anything, your best bet to make that deck function would be during this era, because of the fact that it is just so diverse and there's so much generic counterplay to everything that, like, every deck feels possible as long as you're playing well, right? So I love this format. I was like, this is incredible. And then I was like, I don't want to keep going though. I want to, you know, see what else is out there, right? So I decided to go back even further. And keep in mind, I did play all of these formats, like, historically. But I just wanted to keep going, like, to revisit them, because, like I said, I really feel like you have to revisit a format to fully understand why, like, if it's good or bad. So I go down to 2010, and I actually jumped to, like, the Frog FTK Inferni. Like, I have all that built. Like, I was playing that, and I was like, this is like, I was like, this is pretty bad. Like, it sucks. And I got to Edison, and at this point, like, Edison was starting to pick up a bit. People were talking about how much they liked it, and I was like, I was actually excited. I was like, oh my god, like, hell yeah, this is another like synchro era format. Like, it's probably pretty skillful. I was stoked. Like, I actually thought that this was a good thing, because I really just wanted to play retro formats with people, right? And full disclosure, I actually played this format historically and remembered it fondly. So, like, I was genuinely excited to go back and replay it. So I started playing Edison, and the more I played it, the more I just couldn't shake this feeling. I was like, this is just a strictly worse version of Tengu Plan format. It's like there's less decks available, less things to do, and less counterplay to things, right? Like, I just feel like there's just random issues with this format, and it was just like, it was so clear to me. I was like, okay, yeah, 2011 is just the better version of this format. That, like, they're pretty similar, but this is just a worse version of this, right? So I came to that conclusion, and I kept going. I went to, like, 2009, played, like, some Cat Synchro, went to, like, you know, Teledad, just went throughout all these years, right? And I went to Go, and when I landed on Go, I was like, this is okay, but I feel like this is for, if you're really into classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, like, very classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, this is the format for you. Otherwise, I don't think it's that great. And again, around, like, by the time I had, like, accomplished and did all this is when I started being like, all right, I'm just going to focus on Tengu Plant format. I went back and I was like, this is clearly the best one. And I'm sure people will realize it's the best one, like, as they explore, right? The issue is what I said earlier. I feel like people went from here to here and stopped. I think, like, it's like they're happy here, so they didn't move on here. And it's like, if you don't know how much better this is than that, you're not going to want to move on, right? And so, like, it felt a little awkward, but I was like, hey, you know, maybe History of Yu-Gi-Oh will come through and it'll promote the format, it'll get more popular. We get to History of Yu-Gi-Oh!
Well, folks, we finally made it. Welcome to Tengu Plant format. Now, when people think of Tengu Plant, they think of a very specific point in time, usually September of 2011.
And in all honesty, they said good things. You know, they said some good things, but they did one episode on the format, and that was Tengu Plants versus Agents. And if you actually play the format, you know that this format has so much more depth than Tengu Plants and Agents. Yes, those were popular decks at the time. Yes, they are strong decks in the format, but like, there are so many decks in this format. Like my library on my website, tcgrewind.com, has 72 decks. And they did one video on the format compared to Edison where they did 4. So I feel like accumulation of all these things resulted in Edison format just being like seen as, oh, this is the better version. This is the better format. This is like, it's so much more popular, right? So people don't want to mess with like 2011. And so it actually kind of killed me. It's actually the reason why I started making content to begin with. Is I was like sitting there watching YouTube content every day, and I started seeing more and more Edison things pop up. And I was like that dude in the meme eating cereal, like looking at the TV, and you're pointing, you're like, they're like, oh, look at the greatest format of all time, Edison. And I'm like, it's 2011, guys. You know, like I felt like I had to like try to shed some light on it because I recognize just how flawed this concept is. Because like I said, I know the gameplay for 2011 speaks for itself. If you play both of these, this one's just way more balanced, way more skillful, way more diverse. Like it's not even close. It's just so much better. And I honestly believe even players like E3 Yu-Gi-Oh, if he actually gave it an honest shot, I think he would agree. Like I genuinely believe that. Like I feel like you would have to be ignoring quite a bit to feel like this is better than this. And just to support this claim a bit further, I'm going to tell you guys my super secret tell on if someone hasn't played 2011 format. So like, I am very confident that Keegan from E3 Yu-Gi-Oh hasn't even played 2011, and he talks a lot of shit on it. I think out of like insecurity that there's a good shot that this format's actually better, right? Like, my tell for this, and this is how I know, like, a lot of the guys, like, you comments on my last video, this is my hard tell. If you have not played 2011 in the last, like, 10 years, you will say a statement like this. 2011 is a bad format because of X card. If you have ever said that, I know for a fact you have not played the format. Like, at least recently. Because outside of maybe BLS or Monster Reborn, which like are probably seen as some of the like most OP or like obnoxious cards in the format, if you want to call them that, there really isn't an actual problem card. And especially if you make the claim that Maxx C is a problem in this format because it's like it basically ends turns like it does in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And like you just lose on the next turn. That's a horrible take, which I have literally heard Keegan make that exact take before. I did a whole video on it talking about how Maxx C is not actually a problem in the format. I broke down literally every meta deck talking about how it's impacted by Maxx C and how it's actually not as big of a deal as people make it out to be. So, you know, if you want, I'll put the link to that in the description. You can check it out because, you know, like I said, I just know if you're making takes like this, you haven't played it. And that's okay. Like, I'm not trying to flame for the takes. Right, like I think they're bad, but like I'm not gonna flame. You know, people flame me for my takes, and I recognize that in my last video, like I made a lot of blanket statements that you know could be misunderstood, and therefore like you know flamed as bad takes, and you know that's fair. It's fine. It's fine. It can happen, right? I'm just trying to say that like if you haven't actually put time into the format and like given it a shot, you're gonna make a lot of weird shit takes on it, and until you give it a shot, you're not gonna know how wrong you actually are on those. So like. That is my tell. If you say X card is a problem in this format, I know for a fact you haven't done it. Because even cards like Monster Reborn, BLS, like I can see why some people are salty about them, but the truth of the matter is, in 2011, there is counterplay to literally everything. You know, if your opponent slams a BLS, you can warning it, or you can effect Veiler it, and reduce its power level significantly, and then out it on the next turn. Like, there is so much back and forth in that format that like I never really feel like I just hard lose to one card like on a regular basis. Like yes, occasionally like something can happen, like you can get sacked. It happens. There's variance in card games, right? But for the most part, there really isn't an actual problem card in 2011. Like if you play it as especially as much as I have, like there's just no shot. All right, guys, so now I want to break down some of my gameplay issues with Edison format. Like I said, you don't gotta even listen to these takes. If you want to just go try 2011 and compare yourself, by all means. But if you're interested in, like, hearing a more hashed out version of why I feel Edison is, like, a bit sus, then we'll talk about it right now. And we'll kind of start by addressing the card pool. So let's hop over to that. All right, so we're moving on to card pool here, and in my last video, admittedly, I probably said a bit too many cards, and honestly, it was a bit unfair, right? In all reality. So I want to talk about, I'm just going to hone in and focus on the cards that I actually think are like a real problem or obnoxious thing in Edison format. Like, for the most part, in my last video, like my goal of like talking about all the cards I did was just being like, hey, there's a lot of broken cards available in Edison, and even if they're not broken now, they can be broken later. I realize now that was a shitty concept. Like that's not fair. So we need to focus on what is actually obnoxious in this format. And it honestly starts with these two shitheads right here, right? We have like Raiko Caius, okay? My biggest thing on these cards is they just lack key counterplay, right? So talking about Raiko first, if your opponent turn 1 sets a Raiko, unless you're playing one of the top decks in Edison, which in reality, like they talk about how diverse the format is, there's like maybe 10 actually decent decks, right? Like, and I know in a recent video, E3 was talking about how there are over 200 viable competitive decks in Edison.
This is very difficult to do in a field where there are over 200 viable competitive decks. I still think it's good to have a general idea.
I mean, if that's the case, then 2011 has 10,000. But, like, at the end of the day, like, I don't know what you're smoking to say that there are over 200 viable competitive decks in Edison. In reality, like, unless you're talking about running Vayu Turbo with one less Vayu, now that's competitive deck number 2, right? Like, in reality, it's like a ratio difference. There's still specific deck types, and there's, like, 10 total that will consistently do well, and then there's the occasional one that squeaks out. And there's like in like RBET, like there are a ton of like representation of various different decks, right? There's a lot, but like you pretty much always see the same few top. Like it's really not that different, right? And so like I just feel like within the realm of Edison format, for a deck to be good, it has to be able to inherently out or deal with Raiko to the point where this card feels less problematic, right? So like if you're thinking about it, your opponent turn 1 sets a Raiko, like a lot of decks, if they don't run floaters, which floaters aren't very common in this format, they just have to like burn a card on it, right? Like, so like the only thing I can think of is like, this is why like zombies is decent and stuff like that, or like decks that can run like Card Trooper, or Sangan, I guess. Like, I mean, those are like one of, so it's a bit harder, but like basically if you have like Goblin Zombie or something, you can swing into it, force the Raiko pop, and get a +1 off of their play. That, or there's cards like Nobleman, but since so many decks run Raiko, if you run Nobleman, you actually Nobleman your own Raikos, which can feel bad. Or there's even like, and like also Nobleman just isn't generic enough, right? Like I want to emphasize that for counterplay to be healthy, it needs to be generic, as in main deckable, and therefore has a lot of targets within the format. I don't feel like that is the case for like Raiko at all. And especially when we get to Caius, or even like Ryza, like Caius and Monarchs as a whole, like, guys, you can lie to me, but don't lie to yourself and tell me that when you play Edison format, there isn't like an absurd amount of situations where you are sitting there thinking to yourself, if my opponent tributes for Caius, I just lose, right? Like, I feel like that's so common. And I know it's true because in my experience of playing Edison, I've had this happen a ton of times where it's just like, man, like, I attacked into a recruiter, now they have like a Goblin Zombie. If they tribute for Caius, I just get so hard blown out, it's not even funny, right? Like, because there's no generic response to this card. Like in 2011, we have Solemn Warning and Effect Veiler. That not only negates Caius, but negates other monsters as well. Super healthy, generic counterplay available for every deck to use, right? And it's splashable in literally every deck. In Edison, there's like Pulling the Rug and Fiendish Chain, and both of those feel pretty bad to run in this format, right? Like, Pulling the Rug is typically a side card, and no one's really main decking it. And then you have cards like Fiendish Chain, which like I guess could be main decked, but there's a lot of flaws with that card as well. And it honestly starts with like just the idea of back row as a whole in Edison. So like your deck has to be able to deal with these cards. And honestly, the best way to deal with it is just probably just to eat them and be able to like make a recovery play on the next turn or something. But like, it's just so hard. Like, I just feel like at any given point you can lose to Caius, right? And I feel like that feels really bad. I feel like that removes some of that skill that people really like and enjoy about Edison format is the possibility of blowout, right? So if you want to run the generic counterplay or like pseudo generic counterplay in Edison, like I want to run Fiendish Chain, all right? That's my answer to these two cards, right? That's how I can deal with it. Well, now you run into the situation of there are 3 back row board wipes that just allow free extensions, right? Like in 2011, there's only Heavy Storm. And when it's only Heavy Storm, it's actually really healthy because that makes Starlight Road just go up in viability. Like, you know, if you want to protect your back row, just set a Starlight Road. There's an actual punish to this card. These two cards, there's no punish for. There's no counterplay. Like, you can Dark Bribe it, which feels pretty bad, or, like, yeah, that's about it. It's Dark Bribe. You know, like, for the most part, there's no punish to this. So that means, like, if I'm trying to, like, have counterplay to these guys, which are floating around in literally 90% of every deck in Edison format, then I also need counterplay to this stack of cards. And it basically just means like these are like sacky one-ofs that when your opponent sees them, you will just get blown out by them. And that just feels really bad to play against. Like I said, like that gets solved in 2011, but it's an issue here, right? And so let's say I want to avoid running back row to not get blown out by these cards. That means I need to run a more special summon heavy deck. Well, guess what? There's Royal Oppression, which I have said in my last video. I'll say it again. This is one of the most poorly designed cards the game has ever seen. It is absolutely atrocious. The fact that there is only one immediate out to this card being MST, and like people said, like, oh, you have Regeki Break, you have Phoenix Wing Wind Blast, like that still like puts you in a box, right? Like there's still only a couple decks, and they're usually the meta decks, like the like 8 meta decks that are good that can maybe run Phoenix Wing or Raigeki Break, but not every deck can afford the discard. And also those are trap cards, like even Dust Tornado, it's a trap card, like it's not an immediate out. The issue with Oppression is while it can get blown out by back row removal and stuff like that, the issue with it is if this card resolves, and all it has to do is resolve the one time, if this card resolves, you probably lose the game. That's just a fact. Like, if I am committing 2 monsters to a synchro and they flip Oppression, they pay 800, and I lose those monsters, I can't make any additional pushes in the turn because I'm already like blown out and losing to Oppression. Like I can't special summon anymore. If my opponent has board control, then it's just the biggest tempo swing you could possibly see in a game, and you just lose to this card. I know for a fact Edison players hate this card. Like, you cannot tell me it's a healthy card for the format. So like, you know, like I said, if you want to avoid getting blown out by all this back row, like generic back row hate, you might run a deck that plays heavier special summons. So but that also means you run the risk of just getting hard blown out by Royal Oppression. It just feels like the skill gets kind of removed or reduced a little bit. Like, I still think Edison is a relatively skillful format, but like, you get what I'm saying, right? And then, so if you don't want to get blown out by Royal Oppression, then maybe you run a deck that doesn't special summon very much. Like, you know, you could do something like Black Wings, or even like Heroes, where like the special summons aren't like that good. But then you run the risk of getting blown out by like the damage step hand traps. There is like actually no counterplay to these cards, and there's way too many in the format. Like, I saw people say, oh, you can book a moon. That's the counterplay. That's not counterplay. That's delaying the inevitable, right? Like, if you're like, unless you're in like a niche situation where you can push for game, like, so you can book something, like, yes, you have 3 book a moon, but you also have to deal with the fact that at any point, if you swing into something, you can just get blown out by one of these cards, and there is literally no counterplay to that, right? So like, that feels really bad. And then of course, if you're maining a deck running a lot of these damage step hand traps, then you run the risk of getting hard blown out by Raiko Caius. You see the box, you see me trapped in there. It just feels like it's really hard to actually be creative in this format. And like by creative, I mean like being able to run like unique archetypes or anything like that. Like in 2011, because all the counterplay is generic, like I can put warnings, veilers, and stuff like that, even like tour guides potentially into any deck. And that means that the deck can function and play well and like I can still play towards my archetypes goals. In this format, it feels like there's so much like random like blowout cards that unless you're playing one of those like primary meta decks, you're probably just gonna lose, right? And so like I just think that takes like a bit of that diversity that people love about the format, and like it really reduces it. Like I've seen E3 Yu-Gi-Oh! Post like a million different decks saying like, oh, here's another different deck in Edison format. But is it really all that different? For the most part, it's just like abusing these power cards like crazy. And it's not actually really playing towards the archetype. It's playing with these with like a little bit of an archetype splashed in, right? Like it definitely feels a lot different. Like when you look at it. And like I said, in reality, there are like 8 to 10 good decks in Edison format, and the rest are like they can maybe do well. Like yeah, if you look at my 2011 tier list, I have like 30 decks in tier 1, and like I base it on this deck can win a tournament, and then these decks maybe can win a tournament, but it's hard, right? That's like the tier 1.5, and then tier 2 is like these probably can't win a tournament, right? Like that's how I base my tier list, right? So I feel like in Edison there's probably like 10 decks that can win a tournament, and then like that can win a tournament like pretty easily. Then there's like a bunch of like piss low decks that are like this maybe can win if there's a player who plays it extremely well and has a like perfect build for it, but probably not. And then there's like these definitely can't, right? And I just feel like this box is exactly what is created in Edison format, and it's one of my biggest gripes with it. And then we really just need to compare this to 2011, right? Like, Raiko Caius are still in existence in 2011, but the reason, like, part of the reason why they became so much less good is because spot removal became slightly less good, as well as there became way more counterplay tools. Like, for example, you see less Raikos in that format, even though it's still at 3 and completely playable, because cards like Reborn Tengu, Tour Guide into Sangan, and even like TGs are floating around to where like that spot removal destruction is inherently less good, which makes it feel like, okay, like, you know, maybe it just reduces the amount of people playing it, right? It reduces the amount of people who are going to play these cards. Same thing goes for Caius. Like, Caius is still a very powerful card in the format, but at the same time, like, there's effect failure, there's warning, there's ways to deal with it. So decks that want to play into a strategy like this hard play into it, other decks opt to not run it because it's less efficient, right? It basically means like you don't have to have so many of these like, I guess, non-archetype cards floating around in your deck. You can focus more on your archetype because there's so much generic counterplay to everything. Same thing with back row decks. Back row decks get inherently better. Like, instead of having Cold Wave Trunade, you have triple MSC and a Heavy Storm. Heavy Storm has plenty of counterplay in the fact that Starlight Road is there, and MSC just pops one back row, so it really doesn't hurt or feel all that bad. Royal Oppression doesn't exist in 2011. Thank God. This card is terrible. Like, and then these are both one-ofs in 2011, where it's a 3-of and a 2-of in Edison, right? Like, so there's just less risk of getting blown out by them, which means like those decks are less commonly played. And again, with so many floaters like Tengu, it also reduces the viability of these cards slightly. Real quick, I just wanted to talk about hand traps as a whole, because you know, I've fully heard the Edison community say things like, oh, hand traps lack counterplay themselves. No, hand traps, first and foremost, are the counterplay. They are typically -1s outside of maybe Maxx C. Like I said, I have a video talking about Maxx C in this format, so go watch that before you go on ranting and raving about how it's like the most OP card in the format. It's not. But for the most part, these are just -1s that help deal with situations to put you in a better state so you don't get hard blown out by stuff, right? Like, and they're like, as a player in this format, you can read and assume your opponent has them and play around them. You can bait them out, and that is your version of counterplay. I have examples of this in my Maxx C video of Joe Girolando doing this to me in my series Tournament of Tournaments. But for the most part, like, there are ways to play around hand traps very nicely in this format, and if you actually want hard counterplay to them, there still is that option. Like, there, you can run things like, you know, Dimensional Fissure, or you can even run like Debunk. Debunk is like probably the best generic answer to hand traps. If you're a deck that gets blown out by Maxx C, then a lot of times in game 2, you'll side in some Debunks just to prevent losing to Maxx C if you are like a super special summon heavy deck. Otherwise, it's really not an issue. It just feels a lot better. In reality, it really just does. And like I said, I just feel like when you're looking at this card pool, looking at this box, I feel like the biggest issue in the card pool is the risk of blowout. And I'll show you an example of that right here. All right, now here is probably one of my favorite Edison format clips, strictly because of the fact that I think this just encapsulates how I feel about Edison format as a whole. Is there are so many situations where a player can be playing perfectly and in the winning position, and then something can happen that lacks counterplay, and then you can just lose, right? So this is a video from E3's channel. This is him playing X-Sabers. I know X-Sabers isn't like an insanely good deck or anything, but all things considered, Keegan is playing this match perfectly. And he's up in cards for a reason, and like he recognizes the situation. So we'll watch this whole clip together. I sped it up a bit. I might speed it up a bit more. We'll see.
Yeah, the Raikou pretty good. We could attack the Sorcerer, force Necro Gardener, and then sack the God, set the Raikou, set the Force. Yeah, exactly. Actually, you know what we should do is we should set one of these, because we know he has Storm. So we'll force him to use the Storm on that, and then we'll set the Force. Oh shit, never mind. Don't listen to me. I'm on crack.
So they know he has heavy Storm in hand.
We fucked up the...
And they know he has Necro Gardener.
It's the first game of the day. You know, we haven't had our coffee.
Here, we'll mute them. They attack into the Chaos Orc, force the Necro Gardener, main phase 2, tribute the Gotems, take the Heavy Storm, and now they set a Raikou. So realistically speaking, from this position, they should be able to set this Mirror Force. In the event that they try to go offensive, they can just Mirror Force. Otherwise, they can just use the Raikou to out the Chaos Orc, right? So better player is currently winning here, right? Like, and they're playing as perfectly as they possibly could. And now we'll see what happens, right? So checks his grave. His grave looks pretty good. And then his opponent just goes ahead and rips a Phantom of Chaos, right? So now he gets to activate the effect, banish a Norialis, and just send everything on the field to the graveyard and proceed to just shit on Keegan, right? Like, there's actually no counterplay, and honestly, reasonably speaking, outside of Fiendish Chain or maybe like a DD Crow, like a preemptive DD Crow or something, there is actually nothing in the realm of counterplay, like in the realm of Edison format, that would deal with this, right? There's no counterplay. So like, he just loses the game from here. If you don't believe me, he drops a Dark Creator. Here it comes. And then he goes from there and like ends up making like a Vayu punish. And like, there's no Dark Hole in this format. There's no punish for the overextension. So they just end up losing. He rips a Nimble Hamster, and then boom, the game's just over. He ends up scooping, right? So like, I feel like situations like that frequently happen in Edison format. Maybe not specifically like Norialis, but it's just like, oh, my opponent tribute for Caius, I get blown out. My opponent has one of those spell one-ofs, I get blown out. Right? Additionally, I oftentimes compare September 2011 to Smash Melee. If you don't know anything about Smash Melee, it's the fighting game you see on the screen here, and it is one of the more skillful versions of the game. While there's been multiple copies of Smash that have been printed throughout the years, like from like the 64 all the way up to now the Nintendo Switch, there's been multiple iterations of the game, but people in the Smash community will like, there's still a competitive scene for Melee as well as the current game. That's always been the case. Melee has always been that go-to retro format that people play because it is so skillful. And it's like so balanced, right? There's been multiple times throughout history of Melee where people will say like a character is bad, or like, you know, in the case of you, you'd be like, oh, a deck is bad, right? Or a deck is OP. But in reality, like, there's been so many players like that have proven that their character is significantly better than people gave them credit for, and that's off of their own skill. And I feel like it's very true to 2011. Any player can play just about any deck, and if they're very passionate about the archetype, they can make it work. And I would compare that to a player like Amsa. If you don't know Amsa is probably the world's best Yoshi player within the realm of Smash Melee. And initially, before Amsa came around, the character like of Yoshi was known as a bad character. It wasn't played at all. And Amsa was someone who was very passionate about the character, and he made it work. And now he's like topping every single event, to the point where they bumped up Yoshi on the tier list significantly just because of Amsa being so incredibly good at the character. And like I said, I just feel like that is exactly what it is like in 2011. And Edison format, to a degree, has some similarities, but in reality, I would say 2011 is Smash Melee. It is very balanced, very skillful, and like the player hard dictates the match. And I would say, honestly, Edison format is probably very close to Smash Melee as well, except it's probably Smash Melee with items on. It's where you're playing, you know, Smash Melee, you have items on where someone could like toss out a random Pokeball and then all of a sudden like an Articuno pops out and just one-shots you. That's what it's like to play Edison format in a nutshell. If you haven't seen it, this is my Nordic video I did with the deck's creator, Dave Trepanier. He topped YCS Toronto with Nordics. He was one of the first people to originate it. And we had a discussion about 2011 a little bit in this video. And one of the things he said that also kind of supports this claim is this.
It's not even about that Tengu plants won both those YCSs. Billy Break won those 2 YCSs, and he happened playing Tengu plants. Because looking back, I don't think Tengu plant was the best deck for that format.
I agree. So as Dave said, Tengu Plants wasn't definitively the best like deck of the 2011 format, right? Billy Break was just the best player of 2011 format. And I think that like this is one of the few formats, like if you look at all the like, you know, skillful formats throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history, I think this is the format that really just removes the most variance or like sackiness compared to other formats, right? So if you look at like, Goat's renowned as being very skillful, people really enjoy it. But there's still the Trinity in there. Like, there's like Pot of Greed, Delinquent Duo, and Graceful Charity. Like, your opponent sees those before you do. You kind of like, it feels kind of bad, right? In Edison format, there's like a bunch of like sacky cards like, like Raiko Caius, or even like, Trunade Cold Wave, or like Royal Oppression, stuff like that. Like there's just cards in the format that like when resolved against you feel really bad and just feel like it just sets you so far behind. But in 2011, it's very back and forth, very even, and honestly extremely skillful. Like I am very confident it is the most skillful format Yu-Gi-Oh has ever seen. And like it just takes a lot of knowledge on the format to like play it properly. And I think that's part of maybe the reason why it's not as popular is players like give it a shot and then they probably lose a lot because it's actually kind of hard to get good at. Like you actually have to really think about like a lot of the details, but once you do, it's just one of the most rewarding formats to like get good at or learn because of just how much skill is in it. Like you genuinely get rewarded for how well you play because of all the counterplay tools that the format allows and just how good that card pool really is. And to further support this claim, I just wanted to talk about a live stream I did with Grapha Dragonlord, who ended up placing 5th place on our recent Tengu Mania 2 tournament. And we VOD reviewed literally every single one of his matches. And even though he ended up getting 5th, which was pretty good, we both recognized that there were so many of ways he could have optimized his play to ended up honestly winning the whole tournament based on like his performance. Like he was on a very good trajectory to win the whole thing had he played perfectly. And him openly admitting on that stream and recognizing that, hey, I could have played better. This could have been a better like tournament for me. And knowing that like he needs to practice the deck more or whatever to, win next time. That just shows like kind of the raw skill involved in this format compared to others. Lastly, just a couple other cards I wanted to bring up and mention that don't really create that box I was talking about earlier, but still I feel a bit unhealthy to exist in Edison. We're going to talk about these 3 here, and then I wanted to touch on Trap Dust Shoot because I had a lot of people comment in my last video about how I didn't cover Trap Dust Shoot, so we'll get to that last. But for Goyo, I just feel like this card feels really bad because it's so generically easy to make, and it's like a 2800 beta that just steals boards. Like basically, like in Edison, almost like the reaction to play feels stronger than the actual action of play. Like what you decide to do feels like less good than what gets responded to you, almost, where like responses to things feel more powerful, which almost like punishes you for making plays to a degree. Goyo is a good like encapsulation of that. Like if I synchro into a Stardust and my opponent just makes a level 6 synchro and just swings over it, it just feels really bad, right? Like, and there's a lot of ways to make a generic level 6 synchro. Like there's like Blizzard, there's like Plague Spreader with things like, there's all kinds of ways to make this. So like it just steals your board, feels really bad. Brain Control, I've already talked, like this card is like so Mongo broken. Like I feel like this, like, people talk about Monster Reborn being an issue in 2011. In Edison, this card has absolutely zero counterplay outside of a life point requirement. And, like, not only can this just be, like, played to swing over for game, it's just such a versatile card. Like, in 2011, Mind Control is like one of the more powerful cards in the format, if I'm being completely honest. Like Mind Control is very strong in that format. And then you have, but like in Edison, Brain Control is like Mind Control on steroids, and they also have Mind Control. Like I just think like this card is just so unhealthy, and like I'm so glad that it doesn't exist in 2011 because it's just such a blowout card. Like easily one of the most broken cards the game's ever printed. Then we have Substitute, and people had the gumption in my comments last time to be like, oh, this card isn't a problem or isn't OP. Like, bro, this card does do a lot. You know, maybe it's not necessarily a problem, right? But it does feel very, very powerful. Like, to the point where it thins your deck a million cards, like non-once per turn effects, can set up the dupe lock. Like, it just does a lot of like obnoxious things and feels kind of bad to play against. And again, there's no real counterplay to it. If Effect Veiler existed, maybe it'd be a little bit more fair. I'm just saying. But, you know, at the end of the day, like, yeah, the fact that it thins your deck so much and, like, just fills your graveyard, sets up your grave with tons of frogs, it just feels kind of bad to play against, right? And lastly, I want to talk about Trap Dust Shoot. So many people were saying, oh, why didn't you say Trap Dust Shoot? Like, this card's a problem. And, like, I have two reasons for this, right? The first one is because this card is shared between pretty much all the retro formats, right? Like it exists in just about everything. Like I personally feel like if it exists in both Edison and 2011 and I'm primarily comparing the two of them, then it's hard to be like, hey, like this card's like a huge problem, because in my opinion, honestly, as far as 2011 goes, I don't think Dust Shoot is a problem. And so I don't think it's a problem in Edison either. Like I feel like this card is a high risk, high reward card. If you open it turn one, you can potentially win a game off of it. That's kind of cracked, right? But if you see it later in the game, it can be a dead draw, and you can potentially lose a game off of it, right? Like I think it's like, if you want to run the risk, it's fair. It's kind of like that rank up Magic card people were running for a while, where if you draw it for turn, then you get to like summon the big boy, and it was like insane. But then at the same time, if you like open it, it just felt terrible. You know, it kind of felt like, it feels like that to me in this format, where like it can do something really powerful, almost game-winningly powerful, but it has to be opened at the right time. Like typically people side this out going second, you know, like I just don't really think this card is like an actual problem. That's just my personal opinion. I know people hate this card, and like don't enjoy playing against it, but just like I've won games where I've had Dust Shoot resolved against me, just as well as I've lost games because Dust Shoot was resolved against me. So like I just don't really feel like it's like, I feel like it's like a small percent chance where this card just blows you out super hard. And I think there's got to be other things going wrong with your hand or something to make it where you just lose strictly to Dust Shoot, right? So, yeah, those are the other cards I wanted to address. Guys, ultimately, my point is that the card pool is actually pretty narrow in Edison format, which therefore kind of makes the like diversity a bit fake, right? Like, yes, Edison is diverse, right? Like it is diverse to a degree, but I feel like a lot of it is like people are trying a bunch of different stuff because there's a pretty large player base for it. But ultimately, like the same few decks typically top. Like I said, I would narrow it down to probably like 10, and then the occasional one that like squeaks through. Like just look at the different ones, right? So that's RBET1, this is RBET2. So we're just looking at like the top 8. Like for the most part, we're just seeing the same things. It's like heroes, you see like, you know, Blackwings, and then the further along you get, you know, especially once we get to the most recent one, like you go to RBET4, literally half of top 4 was Blackwings, man. Like, I just look at it as like, people are always telling me, oh, this format's so diverse. And then I look at the tournament reports, and 9 times out of 10, it's literally just the Blackwings, you know, like it's mostly Blackwings because this deck is overloaded. And I think like, this tournament, while it is just one tournament, I do feel like it is a trend that kind of shows like, hey, this is the direction the game's headed in, right? Like the format's getting more and more solved, and I really feel like Blackwing's just way too consistent and powerful to not be like mega represented. Then you compare it to 2011, where we recently had our Tengu Mania 2 tournament, and honestly, like representation was still pretty small. We only had like 40 people compete in it, and like even with a large number of like Tengu Plant Agent decks in there, which is common when people are like, you know, relearning a format, they're going to default to those like more popular decks. Like even through all that, like our top 8 was like super diverse. We only had like agents repeating like a total of 3 times in top 8. But for the most part, like every deck in top 8 was extremely unique, and we even had a brand new deck that we had literally never seen before win the tournament, Falcon Punch. Like, I definitely feel like the further we go on in this format and the more like solved it becomes, like, I don't actually think you can solve this format. I think it's so balanced that there are just so many different decks that you can play where like anything can win depending on the player, right? So like, I just think this, even as like with a smaller community and smaller player base and like smaller representation, I just feel like this is such a better indication of what is to come from this format, if that makes sense, just because of how many different playstyles were in the top 8. And yeah, like I said, I just feel like it's really good. Even if you look at the other Tengu Plant tournament in that like format library hosted not too long ago, they had 4 unique decks in top 4, right? Like they only showed the top 4, like there's 4 unique decks, right? Like it just really goes to show that like this format really has absurd potential to just be like so far and away more diverse, and it's like I said, it's just way more enjoyable, guys. Just give it a shot. That's my only goal. All right, lastly, I just want to talk about what I feel the benefits of playing 2011 are. Like, if you're, opting to give this format a shot, what makes this format so good? And first and foremost, especially when you're comparing this to like Edison format, like the card pool is just so incredibly good, right? Like you get access to cards like Effect Veiler and Solemn Warning. These just give you generic counterplay to things in the game. And when counterplay is generic, it feels really good because it means that like every deck can kind of compete with the strong power plays of every other deck as well, making this nice form of balance and really like enhancing the gameplay to be more focused around skill than anything else. And I really feel like this is one of the formats that does that. Additionally, you also get cards like Pot of Duality added to the mix, and even like Tour Guide to get you a Sangan, which can search you things from your deck. This also enables decks to become far more consistent in this format, which means that like the decks you play just generically feel better. You often like you brick a lot less, and it just feels like your decks are much more functional because of the addition of cards like that, right? So I think that's really good. And then this point here, that this is probably like a much better way to approach this than how I did it in my last video. In my last video, I said this in a very long-winded way, and I recognize that wasn't very appreciated. So by playing 2011 over Edison, you get access to 25 brand new decks that otherwise didn't exist in Edison, including some fan favorites like, Dragoonity, Fabled, even Kar Curry. And then you also get a bunch of decks in the game that like got significantly better through cards added to the pool to make them feel a lot more complete. And I know I said the complete thing and people took that quite literally by saying like, oh, every deck's incomplete. Yeah, I get it. You want to argue. But what I mean by that is the decks feel so much more functional in this form than what they did in the earlier iterations. Like Gravekeepers getting Recruiter felt really good for Gravekeepers. X-Sabers getting Dark Soul felt incredible for X-Sabers, right? And then even looking at some of the classic decks in Edison format, like Vayu Turbo, for example, or even like Diva Hero, those decks are still very strong in 2011. They still feel good to play, and like they're completely viable if you want to take them to a tournament. So in reality, like the transition isn't that big of a deal. It's not that different. All you really get is added counterplay to things to increase the skill and more decks to play. That's like the only difference, right? Like I still think that, I stand by what I said. Edison is exactly what people think it is. It's skillful, it's balanced, it's diverse. But at the end of the day, it's very clear to me, and it will be to you if you give it a shot, that 2011 is more balanced, more skillful, and more diverse. There's just more to do. That's just, when you go a year later, there's a year worth of cards that came out and the game got better. So yeah, that's about it for this video, guys. All I can ask is, like I said, you don't got to listen to any of my takes on Edison format. You don't got to agree. I'm more than willing to have a healthy discussion in the comments if you want to. I'm also more than willing to teach any of you how to play 2011 and, get into it, get a good feel of it if you're interested in giving it a shot, right? Like, I want you to have a good experience, and I'm more than willing to show what that looks like. And if you guys are interested, I will put a link to the Tengu Plant Discord in the description below. If you want to join and try and learn how to play, like I said, myself, I'm happy to teach you, and I'm sure there's plenty of people in there that are down to play with you, teach you how the format works, and just show you a good time. So it's a great community. I've been really happy to be a part of it, and I'm more than willing to welcome new faces. So, right. So, I'm down to do that. If you want to come at me in baby rage and, you know, just tell me it's shit takes or whatever, like, I don't really care, man. Like, I have one goal. And like I said, it's not to try to talk you out of playing Edison or tell you that Edison is bad. It's just to show you that there is something better out there. And I feel like until you give it a try, you won't actually know. So, yeah, that's about it for this video. This will probably be my last video I talk about Edison on, because quite frankly, I have better formats to talk about. So yeah, that wraps it up. Thank you so much for watching this video, and make sure you guys have a great time dueling today.
Going fast makes me feel. I think I slipped in shit.
I can fix that.
Thank you.